here in the School of Business. And it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Elizabeth Stark. Now, Elizabeth is a leader in the global free culture movement. She's a visiting fellow at the Yale Information Society Project and a lecturer of computer science at Yale. She's a graduate from the Harvard Law School, and while there, she founded the Harvard Free Culture Group and served on the board of directors and Students for Free Culture. While at Harvard, she was also editor-at-large of the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology and worked with the Harvard Advocates for Human Rights to make better use of new media to promote human rights. Elizabeth spent years researching for the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard and has taught courses ranging from cyber law to intellectual property to technology and politics to electronic music. She is the founder of the Open Video Alliance and recently produced the inaugural Open Video Conference in New York University. That was in New York University, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
I was there, and it was quite a crowd. There were 9,000 participants in person and across the web. And Elizabeth regularly gives talks around the world. As a matter of fact, last December she was in India, touring the country, giving lectures and talks on free culture to various university students. And she has collaborated with numerous organizations on promoting shared knowledge and the open web. She has lived and worked in Berlin, Singapore, Paris, and Rio de Janeiro, and speaks French, German, and Portuguese. Elizabeth Stark.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm incredibly excited to be here. And as I was telling some of your colleagues before, in the spirit of my talk, I'd really like to engage in a discussion and conversation. So here's the plan for this afternoon. I'm going to go through my talk first, and then I'd love to spend probably the second half of our session engaging in a discussion, hearing your comments, questions, and things along those lines. So hopefully, if that's okay with everyone, I will begin my talk. So as mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Stark. I've been involved in the free culture movement for about 6 years now, and I teach about these issues at Yale University. The topic of my talk today is going to be free culture, the future of creativity, collaboration, and knowledge. So first, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the concept that we know as property. Generally, when one thinks of property, they think of, for example, this laptop or that chair. There's something very specific about this type of property. First of all, it is a rival good. For those of you that are studying economics, I'm sure you've heard this term before, but basically that means if I take this laptop and give it over to Frances, she will have this laptop and I no longer have it, right? Property, as we know it for physical goods, is also the type of right where there aren't necessarily exceptions. There isn't a right that says, oh, well, I could borrow your laptop for an hour without asking and give it back to you, right? That would probably be theft. So generally, when we think of physical property, we think along those lines. Now enter the concept of intellectual property, as many people call it. Well, in fact, intellectual goods are quite different from physical goods. If I tell you all an idea, for example, about intellectual property, I can have that idea, and you can have it too. It is a non-rival good. Furthermore, within intellectual property, there are a variety of exceptions, which we'll talk about today, where one can make use of intellectual property and not have to demand permission, unlike a way that one would do with physical property. So in that sense, intellectual property is a very different beast than physical property. Something along the lines of copy protection, or DRM, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is an attempt to make intellectual property rival such that people can't copy it. But inherently, both digital goods and ideas are non-rival, and once they are copied and spread, other people may do so as well, and it's not going to prevent the initial person from having had it. Now, some people don't necessarily like this term, intellectual property, because there are such major differences between physical property and intellectual property. And I think when discussing this, we need to consider those very real differences with digital goods and ideas and digital technology. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the concept of copyright. I'm sure many of us have seen this symbol in a wide variety of places, you know, copyright 2010, all rights reserved. But what exactly does copyright mean? Copyright is an exclusive right, generally a bundle of rights, granted to creators on things like songs, books, photos, films, and they allow creators of these works to copy, distribute, perform, create derivative works, as we call it in legal speak, and remix the work, as we call it, maybe in internet speak. Copyright, very importantly, covers the expression and not the idea. So what does this mean? If I have an idea and I write it into a story, you cannot just take my story and copy it under copyright law. But let's say that I wrote a story where there's a happy ending and two people fall in love at the end. If you want to write a story that has the same storyline, you can do so and you would not be violating my copyright. Now, interestingly, and this is something that a lot of people do not know, copyright is automatically granted in this day and age. It used to be the case that you had to register with the Copyright Office. You had to put copyright Elizabeth Stark, 2010, all rights reserved. Nowadays, you do not. So, and this is generally the joke, if you were to take a napkin and scribble a drawing on it and give it to your friend, actually you would have a copyright on that. And if they tried to copy it, they could be violating your rights. So in the digital age, this is increasingly important because that means every photo, every email, everything that somebody creates and posts online has a copyright, whether the author wants it or not. Copyright has vastly been expanded and internationalized via international treaties, the World Intellectual Property Organization, something called the Berne Convention, etc. Now, how long does copyright last? Initially, when the founding fathers of the U.S. Created copyright, the term was 14 years, plus if you were still alive, when that expired, a 14-year extension. Let's guess how long that is today. Well, in fact, the term is now either life plus 70, so 70 years after an author or creator dies, or 95 years. So generally, it's way beyond a lifetime. One other issue, the public domain, hopefully many of you have heard about that. That is generally what happens when copyright expires. So when a work expires, anybody can edit it, anybody can copy it. Shakespeare is an example of a work that is in the public domain. I'm sure you've read a lot of public domain works in your courses or assigned them. And so when copyright expires, a work will enter the public domain. Now, why is it, in fact, that copyright now lasts for so long? Well, in 1998, along came a corporation that we know and love called Disney. And one of the issues was that the first Mickey Mouse film was set to go into the public domain. The copyright on it in Steamboat Willie was set to expire. Now, Disney was incredibly afraid that if this Mickey Mouse film would enter into the public domain, people would take Mickey Mouse and they would remix it and they would do all sorts of bad things with it, and people would be offended. Not only that, but of course Disney has a huge amount of revenue stream coming out of Mickey Mouse and its associated characters. Now, somewhat ironically, Disney took so many stories from the public domain. We have examples of, for example, Alice in Wonderland. Mickey Mouse in and of itself was a parody of a film named Steamboat Bill back in the day. And the way that creators and filmmakers in the early 1900s would make films would be that they would be parodies or there would be jokes or rip-offs of previous films. There are a wide variety of Disney films that took from the public domain. But then in 1998, Disney lobbied Congress to extend copyright law an additional 20 years. So what that meant was any copyrights that existed in 1998 would be extended until 2018, and no new works would enter the public domain. Now, this was called the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, supported by Sonny Bono, and then he passed away, so his wife, Mary Bono, sought to extend this into Congress. And Mary Bono once said, Sonny would have wanted copyright to last forever, but I am told that is unconstitutional, so I'd rather have it forever minus a day. Now, initially, the motivation behind copyright from our founding fathers was in the Constitution to promote the progress of arts and sciences. So the idea was to strike a balance between the exclusive right granted creators on their work to incentivize them to produce work and the public more generally, where they could make use of the knowledge coming out of creation and copyright. So the idea was a balance. It wasn't copyright to last forever minus a day. It was something very much in between. So now enter the internet, the phenomenon that I'm sure we all know and love here sitting in this room. Technology has the potential to foster new kinds of creativity and collaboration on a scale like we could have never seen before. In doing so, we have to rethink the way that we look at ideas and intellectual property, in particular digital goods that surround it. Copyright as it stands doesn't necessarily make sense in an age where the ability to copy a file verbatim, so to make an exact digital copy, has virtually no cost. There's zero marginal cost in copying a digital good. In the way that if I had a book and I wanted to make a copy of that book, I'd have to go to a printing press, I'd have to bind it, I'd have to get a distribution network, I'd have to have trucks delivering it to a physical store. Well, in the digital age, these things don't matter. In an age where anybody can copy verbatim, edit, or remix at zero marginal cost, our pre-existing conceptions don't necessarily make sense. Copyright was designed in an age of physical goods, a la the Gutenberg press, and not one that necessarily is of digital goods. So, how many people here are familiar with this logo? In 1998, along comes an 18-year-old university student at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. His name is Sean Fanning, and he develops one of the most disruptive technologies of the last, say, 12 years, since that was 1998. Here was a simple piece of software that allowed anybody to share files and download directly from another user without the need to upload it to a central server, hence the name peer-to-peer. Just out of curiosity, how many people here were on Napster, and I promise I won't tell at any given time? Okay, so I actually remember my father, who's completely straight-laced, would never do anything illegal if he knew it, telling me that he had downloaded Napster and that he found all of these Beatles tracks that were unreleased and they were incredibly rare. And he couldn't believe that here's something that maybe one would have to pay hundreds of dollars to acquire because it's a limited edition record or so on. And then instantaneously, he was able to find it. It was like a gold mine for him, and he was incredibly excited. So within 1 year of Napster being released to the public in 1999, millions of users from around the world were using it to trade music. So Napster posed to compromise entire business models that were based on the selling of physical copies of music. The Recording Industry Association of America, I'm sure many of you have heard about them. They represent the 4 major labels. They control 90% of the music released in the United States. Sued Napster. The case went to court, and Napster was shut down by a court order. Later on, Napster did relaunch as a more, quote-unquote, legitimate music service with DRM Music, but it was called Napster 2.0. I don't know if anybody remembered that, but I don't think we really do remember it because it never actually took off. But what Napster did was it helped to launch a tidal wave of other peer-to-peer applications and networks, for example, Nutella, Kazaa, LimeWire, BitTorrent. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of those. And peer-to-peer file sharing is alive and well today. So technology makes this action accessible and possible. Even my father, who's normally not the type of person that would do it, was on Napster. But what about the law? Current copyright law in many countries deems peer-to-peer file sharing for unauthorized files as copyright infringement. Now, there's a very big distinction to be made because increasingly a lot of peer-to-peer technology is also being used to share files that are under free licenses, free and open source software. Even some video distributors are using things along the lines of Vooz, which is a BitTorrent client, to distribute their work. But what do you do in a situation, though, when the law is so out of touch with societal norms along the lines, for example, even jaywalking or speeding? When I talk to my students about peer-to-peer file sharing, I generally poll them as to how many people, trade songs with their friends, download video, or so on. And generally, it's the vast majority of the entire class. So what is to be done in a situation where the norms are so out of touch with the law and society? If something is so easy to do by so many people on a daily basis, how could it be illegal? And as we discussed, copyright was developed for an age of physical goods and the printing press, where goods are rival, and not in a digital age where one can very easily and instantaneously copy a file perfectly and at no cost. There we go. So this is a word I'm sure a lot of us have heard very much as well, the concept of piracy. Many people in the content industries, those that are holding the copyright 90% of music in the US, have deemed people engaging in peer-to-peer file sharing for unauthorized files as pirates. Now, actually, as recently as last week, I found an article that said that the major content industries regretted using the term piracy because it has actually become too sexy. And now they want to use another word that doesn't sound nearly as cool. Because as we can see here with the pirate flag, there's an appeal to the skull and bones and the patches and so on. You know, pirates have become quite appealing. But ultimately, 11 years after Napster became mainstream, we are still engaged in this debate, and we are still arguing about these issues where I think in 1999 I would have thought, oh, by 2010 we would have had more solutions to this issue. For example, solutions where both artists and creators can make money off of their work and users are able to download files and pay a reasonable amount of money and not have 90% or 84%, as it were, of what they're paying go directly to labels and not to the people creating the works themselves. So I'm sure many of you have heard of this word as well, this acronym. But so what do the industries try to do about piracy? Well, they created a technological scheme called, quote, digital rights management, or if you don't like it, you may call it, quote, digital restrictions management. So DRM was an attempt to use technology, as mentioned, to make goods that are inherently non-rival rival. This means that by using technology to prevent copying, DRM makes it so that one person, or perhaps a few people, if people had, for example, songs that they bought off of the iTunes Music Store, Apple had their Fair Play DRM on music. But so only one person or a few people can access the digital file at any given time, and if you send it to another person, they may not be able to use it. Interestingly, Apple in their iTunes Music Store, I'm sure many of you have bought files there, no longer has DRM on the music. And this is a battle that I actually covered yesterday in my class at Yale that ultimately was waged between Steve Jobs and Apple, who would prefer there not being DRM, and the music industries that demanded that there be DRM in order to prevent piracy. But guess what? In fact, many studies and the wide variety of reality showed that putting copy protections or putting restrictions on files did not prevent piracy. Cory Doctorow, do people here know the blog Boing Boing? If anybody's ever read it. He's an outspoken critic of DRM, and I invited him to speak at Harvard back when I was there, I believe in 2005, and he had the statistic that generally on iTunes there would be an iTunes-only release. And back in the day, there would be DRM in it, and there was no other way of accessing the file, so you had to get it from iTunes. So the average time it took for a song that was only released on iTunes to get to a peer-to-peer network was 180 seconds. That means that somebody would go to the iTunes Music Store, pay for the file, strip the file of the DRM, and upload it to a network. So clearly, there are incentives here beyond profiting, because nobody's actually making money off of putting that file available online, but people just want to share. So ultimately, DRM did not work to prevent piracy, at least in the music space. Now, there are laws also in the US that prevent people from stripping DRM or getting rid of copy protection technology. This is called the DMCA anti-circumvention provisions, and while I don't want to get too into all the legal issues here, ultimately what that means is somebody could be either sued or could go to jail for getting rid of the DRM on a file that you buy from the iTunes Music Store. So ultimately, there were a variety of lawsuits regarding this, but a Russian programmer that came to the US back in the early 00s was put in jail because he had developed a technology to circumvent the ebook DRM on Adobe's PDF reader. Ultimately, there was a deal that was struck, and he entered into a plea bargain and went back to Russia, and his company was held liable. But Russia, in the aftermath, issued a warning to researchers saying, do not go to the US, because if you're a technology researcher, you may be put in jail for your work. So DRM in the music sphere, as mentioned, is essentially dead. I heard music industry executives at conferences 2 years back proclaiming the death of DRM. But in the video and the ebook sphere, in particular with the Kindle, DRM is alive and well. The Amazon Kindle uses digital rights management and all the books that somebody can purchase, and the iTunes video store still has DRM on them. So this is a significant issue to address in the search for online freedoms. Well, on that note then, I'd like to talk about this term free. So generally when I say free culture, people assume that it means you don't have to pay for anything culture. And I can't tell you how many times I've tried to clarify this definition. But in fact, sure, we do have two definitions for free in the English language. One of them means you don't pay for anything. And if we spoke French or German or Portuguese, we'd have two different words for these terms. But in our wonderful English language, we do not. So free culture is not necessarily about the you don't pay for anything culture. This is what people generally call as free beer. So everyone would like free beer, right? Come on, who wouldn't want some beer that they don't have to pay for, particularly on a college campus? And this is the term used in the movement generally for the concept that you shouldn't have to pay for anything. Some people in Denmark got the idea then, because they were so excited about free beer, to make beer that they called free beer, where the recipe is actually open source. And I've been at events where they will serve you free beer. So if you want to make your own free beer, you can go online at freebeer.org and get the recipe and brew your own. But ultimately, in the free culture sense of things, the idea of free is free as in freedom, free as in free expression, free as in free speech. So the idea behind a free culture, and culture, by the way, is everything that surrounds us, ideas, knowledge, art, creativity. But free culture ultimately is the idea that the ability to access, share, and rework culture is a good thing for society, and that such a culture requires an environment of technological freedom and free expression to go along with it. So what does this mean? So free culture embraces the values of the open web and the open internet. Net neutrality, if people have heard that term, is an important part of free culture, where everybody should be able to access all parts of the internet equally. Because if somebody like Comcast comes along and says, well, we're going to let you watch Comcast videos incredibly quickly, but if you go to, say, YouTube or archive.org and watch videos, we're going to slow that down. Well, that can be a significant threat to free speech, because I don't know about you guys, but there's certainly been times where I go to watch a video, it doesn't load, and I just completely give up. So there are ways of affecting free speech very greatly via the issue of net neutrality. Free and open source software is an incredibly important part of free culture. So I don't know how many people here use the Firefox browser. VLC, do people here use VLC? Those are two incredibly successful pieces of free culture, where the free culture and free software, sorry, where the software is licensed such that anybody can view the source code, can edit it, and then generally, as long as they keep the same terms along with it, they would make that available to anybody else who can then edit the source code and improve upon it, and so on. Also, remix culture, and within free culture, not surprisingly, the idea behind digital rights management or putting restrictions on files and culture does not necessarily make sense. So in a free culture, people would have the right to share and rework culture, and cultural production would not be dependent upon exclusive rights. But this doesn't necessarily mean that people creating culture would not be able to make a living. People often assume that if one makes culture available, there will be no models for survival. But in fact, and I've been doing a lot of research on this issue, and I'm working on a book making this argument, I argue that in many cases, making one's work available to share and access and rework can actually benefit the creator as opposed to detracting from the creator. So, not surprisingly, and I hope that we can all agree on this, culture is not created in a vacuum. We absorb information from all around us. And the internet enables a type of creation that was not previously possible. The amount of power and processing power and RAM on this laptop today greatly exceeds what you would have paid maybe, $100,000 for in a professional movie editing studio a mere 20 or 30 years ago. That is incredibly powerful. And this processing power that we now have has led to a boom in remixing. So we've seen a dramatic rise in engaging in reworking, remixing, and accessing culture. I don't know about you guys, but I think nearly every day somebody sends me a cool remix where somebody took a piece of something and then added in a song from somewhere else and then meshed it all together. Or a song. How many people here are familiar with Girl Talk? All right, so this side of the room likes girl talk. On the first day of my class at Yale this semester, I showed my students a film called R.I.P. A Remix Manifesto that actually chronicles a lot of girl talk's work. So for those of you that aren't familiar with girl talk, he is a musician named Greg Gillis who takes small chunks of music and then mixes them together. So for example, in any given song, you might have 50 clips from other songs, and he loves to take, for example, the biggest funk, soul, hip-hop, pop, just the most recognizable 3-second or 5-second clip of a song and then put it all together. So when you're listening to it, it's almost like complete ADD music where you're like, oh, I love that song, and then it moves on to the next one, and you're like, wait, I wanted to hear the rest. So Girl Talk's music is rather contentious because he does not license the samples from the songs that he's using. And in fact, if he would try to license those samples, and check out ripremix.com. The film is R.I.P. A Remix Manifesto. It's available freely online. But if he were to try to license these tracks, the cost of production of his album that he makes on his laptop would be in the millions of dollars. So as a creator and as somebody engaging in remix culture, he just couldn't possibly afford the rights to do so. And in fact, there are a variety of people that wouldn't even allow Greg Gillis, even if he wanted to remix it. The Beatles, for example, are known to not grant licenses to remix or to sample no matter what. So even if you say to those holding the rights, and it depends who holds the rights to the Beatles songs, I will pay you, $1 billion. I don't know, maybe they'd say yes then. But generally, copyright grants somebody the right to completely deny the right to remix. So one example of this is the book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, more commonly known as Alice in Wonderland to us, that was written by Lewis Carroll in 1865. So it is now in the public domain. And because copyright did not last very long, it entered the public domain not too long after it was written. So in 1865, Lewis Carroll writes Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. In 1951, Disney puts out the film Alice in Wonderland, taking from the public domain work Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and this is the film that we all know and love. In 2007, along comes an artist called Pogo, who takes clips from the film Alice in Wonderland, takes the music from it, and then creates a video out of that work. So let's hope this works. Oh, you know what? I don't have audio. All right, I'll just make it really loud. Can you guys hear this okay? All right, so Pogo, the remix artist, took elements of Alice in Wonderland and the music and created a dramatically different work, which in copyright terms we call a transformative work. Although you do see the source material from Alice in Wonderland, clearly this is something very different and has very different music from the original. So then in 2009, along comes an anonymous hacker who creates the site YouTube. Had anybody seen this site? Because unfortunately, what I really wanted to do was go on the site and show you so I can explain to you, so you can see the screenshot here. But essentially what it did was it played the audio soundtrack of a video, but then it took it frame by frame and then would have it running across the screen. So you can envision that this would just be moving, and each frame of the video would then be moving across the screen. And it looked really cool. So generally, that would be the end of an exciting story where you could see the different layers of remix culture. First a book, then a film, then the remix of the film, then a remix of the video of the film, and shown in a different manner. And that's a great story about remix culture. But unfortunately, there's an addendum to the story which isn't nearly as uplifting. The first addendum is, a few months ago, I was telling a colleague about the Pogo video, saying, Pogo is really well known for his great Disney remixes. He has a big following online. I went to go find the video. And when I clicked on the video, I saw that it said, sorry, this video is no longer available. And as somebody engaged in these issues, and I also have worked on a site called YouTube, T-O-M-B. The site is youtube.org, where we track the videos that are taken off of YouTube. I was concerned. So I sent an email to Pogo's manager and said, what happened? Was this video taken down? It's completely transformative. There's a really big case for fair use, which we'll talk about in a second. And he said, well, what happened was Disney hired Pogo to do remixes. And I was thinking, oh, well, this is great. This is a great example of somebody that went online and was creative and then was able to harness this creativity and the exposure that they got from the internet as a result. But Disney demanded that Pogo take down his remix videos because they didn't want other people to get the idea that they could remix too. So, quite ironically, it was because of Pogo's remixes that he got hired in the first place, but then Disney, who, you know, as we may know, are not necessarily the most forward-thinking people, demanded that he take the video down. So I think there's quite a bit of irony in that. The video is still available on YouTube because somebody else posted it, but Pogo took his own video down. So then I go to the YouTube site recently, and I loved watching this and posted it on Facebook, and people got really excited. And then I saw a message that said, we're sorry, we got a letter from YouTube's lawyers saying that, and as a result, we will no longer use YouTube's API, which is a means of allowing people to access another website and program on top of it. But you can still use the site in some ways, but it may not work. So unfortunately, because of a letter from YouTube's lawyers, the YouTube site no longer really functions. So this isn't very much of a happy ending at all, which then brings us to the issue of fair use and its importance in the digital age. So what is fair use? Within copyright law, there are exceptions. As mentioned, copyright and intellectual property, more generally, is not analogous to physical property. And our legal system and our judicial system has deemed that there's a role for for free speech and the First Amendment to play in copyright law. So generally, there are a variety of exceptions to copyright law, and fair use is one of the most important for free expression and for the First Amendment. Fair use allows people to make use of a work generally for criticism, for commentary, for educational use, for a parody. There was a big case, does anybody remember Two Live Crew from back in the early 90s? So there was the Pretty Woman case where they took from Roy Orbison's song and they basically made an early 90s rap version of that. And the Supreme Court ruled that what they did was a parody and thus a fair use. So they did not have to get permission from Roy Orbison and his estate. Now, fair use is inherently an American doctrine. Other countries around the world have similar, but not exactly the same exceptions. And just generally, what fair use would do is it would allow for uses that should be there and should allow for free speech, but that if we had copyright that was solely allowing creators to control all of the rights, it wouldn't necessarily be possible. So for example, also in 1984, there was a famous case with the VTR, or the VCR as we now know it, the Sony Betamax at the time, that declared that it was a fair use for people to time shift or to record a program on the TV and then watch it an hour later. And that was a major step in not only fair use doctrine, but also in technological innovation, because Jack Valenti, who was at the time the head of the Motion Picture Association of America, did not want Americans to be able to use a VCR and record video programs online, on the VCR. So ultimately, what was unanticipated at that time, because those in the movie industry didn't envision the VCR and the blockbuster video rental market that then turned into the DVD market at the time, became incredibly valuable to the people that were very much trying to stop it. Jack Valenti was known to say that the VCR is like the Boston Strangler to the woman home alone at night. So, in fact, that the VCR was to the American people like the Boston Strangler was to a woman. Clearly, that was not the case, as we have all now hopefully seen. So fair use is an incredibly important doctrine in the digital age, and something along the lines of DRM, as discussed, can inhibit making a fair use. Because if it is illegal for you to strip, for example, many DVDs have DRM in them. It's called CSS, Content Scrambling System. If you're a media studies student and you want to take small excerpts of your DVD for your presentation for your class, if you break that DRM, even if the use is fair, you're still violating the law. Because in fact, those anti-circumvention provisions lie on top of copyright law, so there are two layers of legal protection there. And this is a serious issue, and the courts have actually said, well, you could take a camcorder and you could record it on your TV, and then you could modify it, and you wouldn't be violating the law. But if you go in and crack the DRM on the DVD, then you would. So there are some quite serious issues with the strength of fair use. Furthermore, documentary filmmakers. Do we have any filmmakers here in the room? Excellent. Now, fair use is an incredibly important tool for documentary filmmakers. But there's an example where a filmmaker who was making a film about stagehands at an opera caught a shot where The Simpsons were on screen. And this was merely for a matter of seconds, and it wasn't the focus of the shot, it was in the background. And the filmmaker went to Matt Groening, creator of The Simpsons, and asked for permission. He said it was okay, but then Matt Groening said, well, just talk to Fox, went to Fox. One person said, well, talk to this other person. Ultimately, he was told that he must pay something along the lines of tens of thousands of dollars for this several-second clip in the background of The Simpsons on a TV that was already occurring. He knew that it would be a fair use, and he wanted to stand by that right. But he was told by a variety of lawyers that even though it is a fair use, Fox will sue you out of existence, and it does not matter because the amount of legal bills that you would have in defending your fair use would far exceed anything that you could possibly afford. So what did the filmmaker do? The filmmaker swapped the video of The Simpsons out in editing and put in a clip of his own film because he was chilled, even though he had a legitimate right to a fair use. Ultimately, the court is the arbiter of what a fair use is. So you cannot just say something's a fair use. You need a court to make that determination. As Professor Lawrence Lessig has said, fair use is the right to hire a lawyer. So that is an issue that we need to address. So how many people here have heard of Creative Commons? Oh, great. Okay, this is a good crowd then. So for those of you that do not know, Creative Commons is an organization that creates copyright licenses. Now, what does this mean? This means that generally when you hold a copyright on work, you will say all rights reserved, and you will reserve all of the rights granted to you, for example, to reproduce, to distribute, to make derivative works, to perform a work, to display a work, and to perform a work digitally. Those are the 6 rights granted in copyright. But what if you're okay if somebody copies your work? What if you are perfectly fine if they remix your work? Under the normal law, every time somebody would want to do that, they'd have to email you or call you, send you a letter, contact you, and you'd have to give them express permission. Now, this is not very effective when potentially millions of people could want to do that. So Creative Commons provides a suite of licenses that allow for authors and creators to enable the sharing, remixing, and distribution of their work. It allows artists to choose to share their work freely, which has fostered the growth of what is generally called the commons, or the body of information that people can access, share, and rework. So, for example, one of the most successful Creative Commons licensed works is, who knows what this is from? Yes, Wikipedia. Wikipedia uses the attribution share-alike license, which is much like a free software license, which says that anybody can copy the work as long as they keep the license along with it. So you can copy it, you can edit it, but you have to keep the same terms so that other people can copy and edit it as well. So along the lines of collaboration, new technology has enabled people to work together on projects like never before. The networked society and digital technology has fostered this potential. So how many of you use Wikipedia just generally? All right. How many of you use Wikipedia on a daily basis, or a generally daily basis? Interesting. How many of you have ever edited Wikipedia? Interesting. So, if back in 2000 I had said to you, I have a great idea for a website. It's going to be an encyclopedia that anybody in the world can modify or edit, and anybody can change. Would that sound like a good idea to you? No, you'd sound like a crazy person, right? You'd sound like that was the stupidest idea ever. We have Encarta, we have Encyclopedia Britannica. Why would you want an encyclopedia that any old person could mess up, could put errors in, could do all sorts of bad things to, right? Wikipedia is the dumbest idea that ever has worked incredibly successfully. Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, fostered a community that started with merely 20 articles to now one that has millions upon millions of articles in hundreds of languages. And why has it been so incredibly successful? Well, I would argue, first, because of the spread of digital technology that facilitates the ability for people to collaborate across borders, across time zones, across language barriers even. But then also, there's this very simple and elegant aspect that anybody can edit. Right? So the very elegant means of going on Wikipedia, reading an article, seeing that there's a spelling error, a typo, or a grammatical issue, and being able to modify that and scaling that across millions of people has been incredibly powerful. My grandfather, a lot of my family in here, loves Wikipedia. He uses it every day. He thinks it's the greatest thing ever. But I only recently informed him that anybody can edit. My grandmother also, I think at the same dinner, informed me that Twitter has a 140 character limit, which I was totally shocked because she doesn't even know how to use the internet. I tweeted that, by the way. But I often wish, after seeing the success of a project like Wikipedia, which has fostered a community, and by the way, there is no one dictator. There's no one person deciding things for Wikipedia. There's a community set of governance where the users come together and they engage in creating the rules and standards and so on. And for example, some of the cardinal rules of Wikipedia are neutral point of view. So because it is an encyclopedia, the Wikipedians, as they're called, the community, they do not want biased articles, but they want to present a variety of sides and perspectives on a particular issue. That doesn't mean that it's always going to be given equal weight, but they want to have this quote-unquote neutral point of view, and that's one of the guiding principles. Another one is verifiability. So Wikipedians stand behind backing up things with sources. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that citation needed tag. Well, next time you see it, maybe if you have a few minutes, look for a citation for that and then put it in there, because it's incredibly important for Wikipedians that works have something, and the sentences and the facts that are in there are backed up by sources. And then the third is no original research, which means that Wikipedians don't want people just thinking up their new theories on Wikipedia and putting it there. If you have research that you want to do, you should publish it elsewhere, and then somebody can take that source and back it up. So Wikipedia is not the place for you to engage in research. It's the place for you to do research on topics and bring in those sources from elsewhere. But Wikipedia is essentially one of the best examples we have to date of the type of participation and democratization that technology and new media fosters. So old media, the TV of yesteryears, was a one-to-many medium. You had one newscaster on screen who was talking to many people in the audience. The internet and new technology enables a many-to-many type of medium, and I think Wikipedia is one of the main examples of how this can occur. The democratization of culture, when anybody can take part and participate, is one of the major aspects of free culture, and it is at its essence. I don't know if people here are engaged in blogging or have been involved in citizen media, but citizen media and the ability for anybody to take a video or to write a blog post and to cover a particular event occurring around the world also demonstrates the possibility that technology can foster for free speech, for democracy, for media, and so on. And this kind of participation enables a type of power that we previously have not seen. It's true that in years past and in centuries past, there was a type of folk culture where people would come together and they would sing the songs of the day and they would collaborate on that. And building upon that, digital technology has enabled people to have the type of power where one blogger or one person posting a song or a video or an image could have a potential impact on the world like they would never be able to do so before. I've been involved in campaigns where we post videos that then have hundreds of thousands of views, possibly even millions, where could you imagine the type of advertising expense that even a mere 20 years ago you would have to have, basically spent a whole lot of money to get millions of people to watch something that now with the internet is incredibly important and possible. That's not to say that every video is going to get millions of views, but even the means of putting oneself out there and getting exposure is incredibly powerful. So along those lines, knowledge equals power, and the ability to use digital technology to foster creativity, to foster collaboration, to create things along the lines of Wikipedia, and as I hope we'll talk about after, open educational resources, open access, to put knowledge and information out there for the entire world to make use of, is incredibly powerful. So if you're interested in any of these issues, I would encourage you to get involved. The website for the organization that I'm involved in is freeculture.org, and I hope that you enjoy this talk. So thank you very much. And as mentioned, I'd love to take Q&A or just discussion or your thoughts or anything along the lines of what I said this afternoon. Yeah.
We're talking about free culture, but not every single government allows free culture. A great example is Iran, China. So how do you see free culture evolving in those countries?
That's a really great question. In fact, someone debated as to whether the U.S. government allows for free culture when Disney is so easily able to influence the copyright law. But what do you do in these type of authoritarian regimes where not only can somebody not post a video online, but in fact they could go to jail for doing so? And I think there's an incredible opportunity that digital technology can prove. And granted, this isn't to say that I think that the benefits of technology are always positive. There are potential privacy issues that I know that many of you have talked about, and I'd be happy to discuss that as well. But in a scenario like Iran, and that's something that I followed quite a bit, I think the role of citizen media was incredibly influential. At the same time, Iranians were able to get the word out there in a way that even 20 to 30 years ago would not have been possible. Now, that's not to say that I think that the Iranian government should crack down on their citizens in the way that they should, because I absolutely believe that is a major violation of human rights. But technology can be used for the positive. So, for example, the word can get out there. People can tweet messages, which, according to some reports, the role of Twitter in Iran was actually not all that great. But what Twitter was able to do was to get the word from Iranians to the rest of the world and to expose what was going on there. The role of, for example, cell phone video cameras. I mean, that's something that has really only come to light in the last few years, where one can take video of a protest, send it to somebody, upload it to YouTube, and then the rest of the world can see what's going on, can provide for this means of showing the rest of the world what is going on in a country that is ruled by an authoritarian regime. And where the negative sides come in is, for example, when the Iranian government is demanding that people hand over their Gmail logins, their Facebook logins, when they're going through their Facebook friends because people at the border or people that they've arrested have no choice but to comply, and then they're able to see all of their colleagues and then track them down and use the power of technology for an Orwellian-style negative end as well. So clearly there are two sides to this story, and I'd like to believe that the pro-democracy movement, for example, in Iran, can use the power of technology to stand up to the draconian response of the government. But I completely agree that there are very much two sides of the story, that when the government then is able to surveil people. There was one example of a website where the Iranian government had posted the faces of protesters. And it was in Persian, but essentially what it said was, please contact us if you know the names of these people. And what they were essentially trying to do was crowdsource the names of protesters from anybody on the web to tell the government who the protesters were so that they could then arrest them. So those are some of the potential downsides when technology, like virtually any medium, could be used for both good and for both evil. Yeah.
I'd like to go back and touch on, excuse me, your narrative of the using download services, Apple iTunes, of course, being prominent, but we all know that they've got competitors, Amazon, Walmart, etc. And what's not clear to me is, has anybody ever conclusively figured out the legitimacy of the Russian music download services? They say they're paying royalties through...
All of MP3, is that even still around? Is that what you're talking about? All of MP3, for example, was one of them?
I think that might have been one of them, MP3 sale or whatever.
So...
.ru after it has got to fall into that category.
So that was a rather interesting scenario, and I do think a lot of those sites have ultimately been shut down. But what the sites were claiming was that under Russian law, there was a means for them to legally sell songs under what is called a compulsory license. Essentially what that means is you don't have to go to Disney or to the Beatles and ask for a license, but the government says as long as you pay X amount, you can get a license. For example, cover songs. If people ever hear on CDs where bands are playing the song of somebody else, in the US, there's a compulsory license for that, which means that you don't have to go to the Beatles, otherwise they'd probably never grant it, and ask for permission, but as long as you pay, and it's a certain number, a percentage of sales or per copy and so on and so forth, as long as you pay that money, then you are legally able to do so. Now, in the remix sphere, there is no compulsory license, and if Girl Talk were able to have something like this, he might actually be able to legitimately pay for the samples in his work. But getting back to the Russian example, so what I believe they had there was a compulsory license that was supposedly very low, where they could sell MP3s at 10 cents a track, and that money would go to the government, which would then give it to rights holders. But copyright law is, as mentioned, internationalized, and the U.S. has often been at the helm, and the U.S. Trade representative, of pushing for incredibly strong laws with regard to both patent and copyright, because the U.S. makes a significant amount of money in their cultural industries, for example, the Recording Industry Association and the Motion Picture Association. So I believe that there was some question as to whether this was actually legal under international law and whether this was legitimate, and there was a lot of back and forth. And then a lot of the sites were ultimately shut down. But it's true that the iTunes Store provides an alternative, particularly now that there's no longer any DRM. But there's a stat that I often like to throw out to people, but how many people here have an iPod? Wow. Okay, so a lot. How many gigs are on your iPod? Is it like, just throw some numbers out there. 8, 16. Okay, so 8 or 16. Does anybody here have like a 60 gig iPod or 180? Okay. So, all right, there you go. Let's say that each track is 99 cents a song. And let's just say that you are going to fill up a 60 gig iPod at 5 megs a track. How much money would that cost, right? A lot. Yeah, a lot of money. $12,000 or more to fill up an iPod. What 18-year-old has $12,000 to fill up an iPod? Even Steve Jobs, in an open letter that he wrote about DRM, said that on the average iPod holds 1,000 songs, and given the number of songs that were purchased on the iTunes Music Store at the time, only 22 of those 1,000 songs were from the iTunes Music Store, so only 2.2%. Of course, there's a possibility that many people would be going and ripping CDs, like my father really likes doing that. If somebody gives me a CD, I'm like, just send me the MP3, or just give me maybe a USB drive or something. But ultimately, the price point, given the consumption patterns of a lot of people, just does not make sense if you have to pay $12,000 to fill up an iPod. And there are a variety of proposals for, particularly on college campuses, services where there would be a flat monthly fee. Somebody would pay that. People could download songs and actually have them work on their iPod. There are services, for example, Rhapsody, if people have heard of that. But the music was ultimately DRM'd, which meant that it would not work on an iPod because the DRM that they used wasn't compatible with Apple's DRM, and so on. So there's still a significant issue, despite the existence of something like the iTunes Music Store, which, by the way, some people think it's really easy to put a song on the iTunes Music Store. I've had a lot of friends and colleagues where they start a record label, it's a small online thing. You think, great, you can put your music on the iTunes Music Store. Well, no. In fact, Apple won't accept music from anybody. You have to go through a digital distributor. What does that even mean in the digital age? Shouldn't you just be able to submit your song to the store? And then they will put it on the music store, which means that then Apple takes 35 cents out of the 99 cents. The digital distributor takes maybe another 10 to 20 cents. And ultimately, what it comes down to is generally on the 99 cents that somebody pays, only 14 cents of that goes back to the actual musician or artist.
Still record labels.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's even less because generally on a CD that's about $16 on average, 10% of that goes back. So $1.60 or on $1, it would be 16 cents. So artists are getting even less of that. And frankly, given that it's 2010, I always thought, well, you know, things will progress. Musicians do not, by and large, hold the right to their recorded work. So the way that it works is they sign over their rights to the labels. So that means when the labels want to come along and sue people, even if the musicians and artists don't approve, it doesn't matter because they're the rights holders. And that's, by and large, what happened with the RA's lawsuit campaign, which I'm sure many of you heard about, which is now supposedly over, even though there are still a lot of suits that are pending. So when you have this disaggregation of rights, where a musician wants one thing, for example, do people know the band MGMT? So I believe they recently came out with a new album. They put it online streaming, and they wrote, we wanted to make this available for people to download, but we were told that we weren't allowed to do this. Right, so even though the band wanted to do one thing, now granted, it's true that the band signed away their rights, but that's generally the way that the music industry works. So what I would love to see is a means where artists can keep control of their work, they can maintain the rights, and then they can choose to allow people, for example, to remix it. If they want to allow people to download it, a lot of artists are also seeing that making their music available online can help spur on concert sales, right? And granted, we could spend like hours arguing about this because there is no one-size-fits-all model for artists and creators, but for some artists, touring and performing is a huge cash cow. And the fact that their music has gotten out there in a way that if we merely had, you know, CDs and brick and mortar stores would never have been possible has been a huge boon to their live performance market. Now, granted, a lot of the record labels are not profiting off of that. They're profiting off of the sale of either digital or physical copies. So they're not, the artists may be happy that their work is getting out there and they're making more money in concerts, but the labels aren't happy because they're not getting a slice of that. There are these new things called, well, not all that new, 360 deals. People have heard of that, which means that a label will actually do all sorts of, they'll do live shows, they'll do merchandise, which is also seen, you know, buy the t-shirt, buy the like tote bag or something. That's also seen as a big cash cow for artists because artists get a lot more out of selling a t-shirt. You know, maybe American Apparel t-shirts, $15, it might have cost you $6 to produce, than they would get on selling a copy of even their own music.
I've seen it on YouTube where the artist has posted their own video and they say it's under their name and there's no sound because the label.
Yes, that's, so an interesting example, do people know the band OK Go? So they got huge because they created some really cool YouTube videos that spread virally as the internet is, you know, want to do, and then like millions upon millions of people had watched them. Yes, they have a new one which is like a Rube Goldberg, if people have seen that. Yeah, so their label, initially they put the video out there without the permission of the label, and then ultimately the label saw that it got huge, so they weren't going to take it down. But their label disabled the embedding function on their videos now, which meant that people couldn't take that video and then put it on their blog or their MySpace page or wherever else, which actually is part of what makes videos go so viral in the first place, because you can embed it elsewhere on the web and you don't have to just go to YouTube to watch it. You could see it on a blog, you could see it on a different website, and so on. And this dramatically decrease the number of views that they got on their video, and the label demanded that users not be able to embed it because they wanted ad revenue to go back to the homepage. So they wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying that labels don't understand viral video, they're not forward-thinking. The reason why we became so big in the first place is because our video went viral, people could embed it and view it elsewhere on the web, and this has been a huge boon to us, but our label just doesn't get it. So there's a bit of a war that has now started between this band and their label. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about faculty's intellectual property rights? And I'm speaking to faculty that have to post lectures, PowerPoints online, or participate in online education. Doing this in the course of employment with an educational institution, but it's the faculty's ideas, and students are printing things. So, and anyone that's faculty knows that you don't really do all your development in the building that you're in. So whose property is it?
So that's a really great question, and when I was in law school, I actually had an exam question that was based on this issue, which is who holds the right to, for example, lecture notes that a student writes from a faculty member's lecture at a university and so on. And the answer, much like with, I don't know if you ever talk to a lawyer, you'll probably get this response, is that it depends. It's like you can never get a straight answer out of them, right? But so in copyright, there is a doctrine called work for hire, which generally means that, and terms vary. For example, the 95-year term now is for what is called a work for hire, and life plus 70 is for an individual author. So what does that mean? A lot of jargon here. So if I decide to take a job working for Disney, clearly they'd hire me, right? And I start writing all sorts of screenplays for Disney and so on, under the law, because I'm an employee of Disney, that would be a work for hire, and they would hold the right to the screenplay, and I wouldn't, if it's done in the context of my job. Now, if I, for example, am doing it in my spare time and not using Disney's resources, and it's not a part of my job, then I hold the rights. But if I'm doing it, either on my work time or in the offices or in the scope of my job, then Disney would hold the rights. Now, the university environment is a little bit different because generally, there isn't as much a distinction of, like 9 to 5 for a faculty member, right? And I believe, in talking to Francis, that here at Quinnipiac, faculty does hold the right to their lectures and so on. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. The university uses instant online courses for using materials, but the faculty owns the content.
But this is something that is largely, it varies from university to university, and it's not entirely resolved because it's not as clear-cut as, a set employee of a particular company, where generally as an academic, it's like everything that you're doing, you're writing, you're speaking, you're engaging in a way that just doesn't conform to the normal corporate job type of scenario, right? So I have a colleague who wrote an entire book on who owns academic work, and I think the answer is ultimately it depends. But I know that there are some universities, for example, USC, where they have a really prestigious film school, and the university says that it holds the rights to the students' films. Now, the students are not necessarily happy about this, and this is an issue that in the free culture movement we've addressed, because if the student is paying the university money and working on a film, shouldn't the student have the right to the film and not the university? So it ultimately can depend upon internal policies as well. But generally, for example, what if a faculty member writes a book, right? Well, many do. Should the university hold the right to that book? And my understanding is no, it's generally, there's a more laissez-faire attitude at a university. They want to encourage their faculty member to publish or perish, hopefully not. So the faculty member would hold the right to that book or the right to his or her lectures, and then the university has, like an implicit license to make use of them. But unless there's a very clear-cut policy in a handbook, or if the general counsel has set something out, it's not entirely clear when it comes to the legal doctrine. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer. Yeah.
I was just curious, why does someone like Regulus not get sued?
That's a great question, and a lot of people are wondering that. And my theory is ultimately because it would be a PR nightmare. So there's this like first mover issue here, right? Where, he uses hundreds upon hundreds of samples in any given album. And there are a wide variety of rights holders. There are the publishing companies, there are the record labels, and so on. And that any one of them could go and sue him, which is a huge risk. But also, that one that goes and sues him will get a huge PR, negative campaign. All of the media outlets will write about it. There will be protests. All the fans, like you guys, will say, like, we want our girl talk. So I actually think it's because of the fear of negative publicity, where I wouldn't be surprised if ultimately he managed to cut deals with record labels. He played at Yale, I believe, last year at the Spring Fling, and he gets paid tens of thousands of dollars for his gigs. So he used to be quite small, and now he's blown up incredibly.
I know that too, though. He gives away his music, but he also sells it on iTunes.
Yes, so he released his most recent album under a Creative Commons license, Feed the Animals. Or is there one after that? I forget. That was the most recent one. Okay. Which is an interesting move because it's not entirely clear if his remixes are a fair use and if he holds the rights to them in the first place. There's this kind of, there's this doctrine in copyright law where if you make a remix of somebody and you have no rights to it, and if it's not a fair use, you don't hold the right to it. So let's say that I make a remix of Madonna, and then a court decides, well, that's not a fair use. So Madonna, because Madonna owns the original work, actually owns all of my remix too. Does that make sense? So it's unclear as to whether Greg Gillis actually holds the rights to his work. It has never been tested in a court of law, so one does not know as to whether it is actually a fair use, and as discussed, the court is the ultimate arbiter of whether something's a fair use. But that said, he still wanted to make it available. He said, I believe this is a fair use. I'm going to put this under a Creative Commons license and put it online. A Creative Commons license doesn't preclude selling a work. So there's no reason why he can't put it on the iTunes Music Store. But what he couldn't do is he couldn't then go after. So let's say I go on the iTunes Music Store. I want to support Greg Gillis. He also did a pay what you want thing, right? Along the lines of Radiohead, I think. But let's say I go on iTunes. I buy his album that's Creative Commons licensed. What he can't do is he can't then sue me for sending it to friends because he has made it available such that other people can share it.
We can continue until 2. However, if there's some people that need to leave or teach, that's okay too.
Yeah.
There's also an issue that under fair use, a critic is allowed a small sample of a book, a poem. I mean, he could claim that he's a critic and he's taking a small sample of whatever and putting it together.
Right, so fair use allows for criticism. There are no bright lines in fair use. So it's interesting, when I teach my students about fair use, there are 4 factors. And those factors are incredibly malleable, and sometimes courts say that one of them is more important, sometimes they say the other. I mean, it's really, like some legal scholars have said, it's like shooting a dartboard with blinders on or blinds on or something, right? Like, you never really know if something's a fair use or not. So yes, he could make all of these arguments, but ultimately it is up to a court to make that determination, and no one really knows. So one of the major cases right now, oh, I'm sorry to lose all these people, in fair use is the Shepard Ferry case. Here, actually, let me see if I can pull this up. If people are interested, one second. Oh, I'm not on.
There's also one with Kieran, he's a cartoonist, and he did a parody of Starbucks.
Really?
Yeah, there's a website, illegalart.com.
Yes.
And I think he's still in litigation. I think Starbucks is trying to wear him down.
So, this is one of the major, not so big, fair use cases right now before a court. Oh, sorry, you guys can't see that. Yeah, it's a piece of artwork. All right, hold on. Let me move this. No. All right, let me. Okay, so Shepard Fairey made this Obama Hope poster from this AP photo. And he, like many people do in the digital age, just did a Google image search and said, oh, here's a photo of President Obama. He used it as a reference point for drawing it. So he did not actually, and we can discuss, and I have this discussion with students as well, whether that makes a difference if he took this and manipulated it with, for example, Illustrator, or what he actually did was he used it as a reference. So he looked at this when drawing that. And the AP, who may or may not be the copyright holder of the photograph, a freelance photographer for the AP took it named Manny Garcia. Manny Garcia says that he holds the rights. The AP says that they hold the rights. Shepard Fairey said this is a fair use, and it's just like one of these, big copyright messes. But the AP has filed suit against Fairey because Fairey used this photo as a reference to draw this Hope poster. Now, one of the things that fair use in copyright law accounts for is what's called transformative use. And I would think that we wouldn't really necessarily argue that he very much transformed this photo in both meaning and in the aesthetics behind it. So now it's behind a court of law. There was also this bit of a scandal where Shepard Fairey said that he used one photo and it was actually another one, and then he lied about it, but it was immaterial to the actual facts of the case, which was really frustrating because it was one of these things where he covered it up because he didn't want to look stupid, but then he ended up looking even worse by saying that the photos looked virtually identical. They were both from the AP, so it was immaterial to the facts of the case. But it was a bit of a scandal, so then he had to switch to a different lawyer, and now one of my former professors at Harvard Law School is defending him, Terry Fisher, who was the one that taught me all about fair use. But ultimately,
And in the middle of all that, he got hired by Saks Fifth Avenue to do a series of shopping bags for them. So he makes out.
Right. This poster made Shepard Fairey huge, right? Like, people had known about his work in Obey before, but this is like, now he's just a figure on the national scene where, everyone recognizes this. But it's still to be determined as to whether the court will rule that his use was fair, or whether they will say that no, the AP is right, Fairey should not have used this work in drawing that. Fairey also made the point that, look, I don't have access to huge famous figures. Like, even though he did do this for Obama, I believe initially he did it and then Obama found out about it and it became a big deal. It wasn't that the Obama administration commissioned him. He said, if I had access to Obama and I could have just sat in a room with him for an hour while I drew him, great. But that's just not possible or practical in the age where not everyone can go and sit in a room with the presidential candidate at the time. And frankly, there are a whole lot of photos that look a lot like this. This photo isn't very distinguished. I believe it's now selling for $1,500 in art galleries, legitimately, this photo, where there would have been, virtually no market for this specific photo if Fairey hadn't taken it and turned it into that. So I think this will be an incredibly important case for fair use, and it's still to be determined as to who will win. When I recently polled a class of my students as to who would win, they all thought that Fairey was in good shape here, but others aren't so sure. So we will see what the future holds for fair use. Yes?
I have a question related to fair use, the TEACH Act, and higher education. And maybe you can give some of us advice that are attempting to be compliant, but certainly are prolific users of multimedia for educational uses. And there was a recent example where the University of California was going to be sued by a company, so they took down all of their videos. And reading this is kind of horrific from the point of view that at least we have some laws, it's certainly not caught up, but things like the TEACH Act that we thought would protect us from that kind of thing. And I don't know how that whole case is falling out, but can you give some advice or guidance in terms of things like that that are happening when, again, we're attempting to be compliant by using what legislation or what laws exist?
Yeah, that's also a great question and entirely relevant to so many people here. I am familiar, I believe, with it was at UCLA, right? UCLA. The UCLA case where there was the threat of a lawsuit. And several colleagues of mine have actually been very much doing work, and they submitted something to the FCC on fair use in education. And I think the major point here is that educators need to be able to make use of fair use and to be able to have, unfortunately, as mentioned, one of the aspects is that fair use is completely malleable. That means that you never know, is 7 seconds going to be a fair use? Would 15 seconds be a fair use? There is no bright line rule. So I think what's incredibly important, and this is something that we're seeing, but I would love to see expanded in, for example, the legal literature as well, is better guidelines for educators to be able to make use of these fair uses. Because we don't want to have a scenario where, even though it could be a fair use, somebody is so afraid to do so, and then you have a company coming and suing you, and even though what you're actually doing is legal, it doesn't matter because you'd have to pay $20 million to defend yourself in front of the company. So my answer would ultimately be that I think fair use generally needs to be expanded for educators. This is something where taking clips, taking excerpts, showing a portion of a video. You could say that I violated Disney's copyright if by showing you that Alice remix, if that isn't a fair use. And if it is a fair use, then I violated Pogo's copyright, the remixer, by showing this to you. Now there is a classroom exception for when the video or the piece of work is acquired by legitimate means, but guess what? I downloaded it from YouTube, so that wasn't a legitimate means of doing so. So in many cases, these exceptions in these laws are out of step with reality. And I think ultimately what is of great import is that we need to ensure that educators can make use of a variety of works. Sure, if you're going to assign half of a book, that's not going to be a fair use, and you're going to need to license that. What we're seeing now is a proliferation of freely licensed educational materials. So actually, in my courses at Yale, and I think this is quite specific to my field, which is law and technology, if I assign a book, it is Creative Commons licensed. Now, I'm very lucky that a lot of my colleagues and the scholars in my field have used Creative Commons licenses. So in that case, you're able to assign a book, you can send a digital copy, people can excerpt it, they can rework it, and that can be completely legal and legitimate. So I think on one hand, we need an expansion of fair use for people to make use of pre-existing works, to be able to show it, to be able to manipulate it in a variety of media or digital media courses, but even in a history course, like being able to view historical images is incredibly important in the educational context. But I think it's equally important to push open educational resources, open access to academic research. Open textbooks is a movement that I have quite a few friends and colleagues who are involved in, where putting free and open source textbooks out there that people can modify, people can edit, people can share, would be incredibly beneficial to the educational sphere, such that you don't have to pay $200 a year for a new textbook, where you think $200 is a lot in this country, which frankly it is. Imagine in the developing world. As Ramesh mentioned, I was speaking in India, where the idea of $200 for a textbook is like mind-boggling. No wonder there's actually a huge amount of textbook piracy in India, because people want access to this knowledge and this education and aren't able to afford it. So ultimately, having the type of textbook also that's modifiable. So many professors already say, well, just read these parts, or I'll add this element in, or so on. Why shouldn't one be able to take different aspects of a particular textbook, add their own elements, and then make that available for their students? And I do have some colleagues at the Berkman Center who, particularly in the legal sphere, where a lot of the work in the textbook is just grabbing from cases which are already in the public domain. So any federal U.S. court cases don't have any copyright on them. No U.S. federal government works are copyrighted if they're from the federal government, so including the federal courts. So because so many of, the excerpts in these books are already just not under copyright, they are seeking to develop a completely open source, editable and modifiable textbook that educators and professors can use and then customize and so on. So I'd love to see, in a matter of years, 5 or 10 years, much more of that going on in the educational sphere. And I think also, sure, there is a profit motive, and I do know that there are professors that make quite a bit of money, like Mankiw, right, has written like every economics textbook out there. But I think that the motivations and ultimately the goals of universities and of professors and academics is very different than like the Steven Spielbergs of the world. And I would love to see universities stepping up. So MIT has their open courseware where they make their course materials available online. Yale has open Yale courses. Harvard, unfortunately, is not very good on the open courses end of thing, but has passed one of the first open access resolutions that makes the research of the Harvard faculty available to the world for non-commercial use, where they can share it and remix it and so on. So I do think that there is a responsibility on the part of educational institutions and universities in particular to make knowledge available to the world, particularly when digital technology now facilitates it in a way that by putting these courses online or putting this research online, people can access it all around the world, where previously they'd have to walk onto the campus and come into the library or get a paper copy of that as well. Other comments? We're running out of time.
We'd love to go on. You're such an informative and provocative and funny speaker.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. If anybody would like to chat, I'd be happy to talk afterwards. But thank you, and I hope that this has sparked some thoughts and on your end. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.